Our story begins not on a battlefield, nor in the halls of power, but on a grey and restless sea. The year is 1497, and a small ship named the Matthew crests the waves of the North Atlantic. Aboard stands an Italian navigator in English service, Giovanni Caboto, known to history as John Cabot. He is no nobleman, no conqueror. He's a dreamer chasing rumours that across this wide ocean lies a new world, rich and untouched, waiting to be claimed. The wind howls across the deck and the wooden hull groans under the strain. His crew are weary, frightened, convinced they've sailed too far. But on the horizon, a thin line of land begins to appear, rocky, forested, at the edge of a continent that Europeans scarcely understand. Cabot drops anchor off what is now Newfoundland. He plants the flag of England in the soil, not realising that this modest gesture will one day echo through centuries, that this moment marks the faint, uncertain beginning of what would become the greatest empire the world has ever seen. At the time, England is a minor power, half forgotten on the edge of Europe. Spain and Portugal dominate the seas, their galleons heavy with gold and spices from the Americas and Asia. France commands vast armies, and the Holy Roman Empire stretches across the continent. England, under the Tudor crown, is small, poor, and divided by religion and war. The notion that this island kingdom might one day rule lands across the globe seems absurd. Yet from this unlikely beginning, the English will rise through ambition, cunning, and above all, the sea. The ocean becomes England's great equaliser. If they cannot rival the armies of Europe, they will build ships instead, fast, agile, and deadly. Men like Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins take to the waves, not as mere sailors, but as privateers. State-sanctioned pirates striking at Spain's treasure fleets. To the Spanish, they are thieves and heretics. To the English, they are heroes, brave men defying a Catholic superpower. In the reign of Elizabeth I, this small nation begins to think beyond its shores. The Queen herself, poised and shrewd, understands the power of the sea. She encourages voyages of exploration, not only for glory, but for trade. Merchants in London form companies with royal charters, the Muscovy Company to the north, the East India Company to the east, the Virginia Company to the west. The seeds of empire are planted not by armies, but by investors and adventurers. In 1588, when the mighty Spanish Armada sails to invade England, it seems that all of Elizabeth's fragile progress may be undone. But storms and English cannon fire scatter the invincible fleet, and the victory electrifies the nation. For the first time, England sees itself as a maritime power, blessed, perhaps, by Providence. The sea, once a barrier, becomes its destiny. Across the Atlantic, new lands beckon. In 1607, a group of settlers founds Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanent English colony in North America. It is a fragile, desperate place. Hunger, disease, and conflict with the native Powhatan nearly destroy it. But tobacco, a strange leaf brought from the New World, soon turns death into profit. More ships arrive, more towns are founded. The English foothold on the American continent begins to grow. Meanwhile, another kind of empire takes shape in the East. The East India Company, founded in 1600, begins as a commercial venture, merchants seeking spices, silks, and tea. But trade soon turns into power. In ports from Surat to Madras, English merchants build fortified factories, hire local soldiers, and negotiate with kings and sultans. Gold changes hands, treaties are signed, and slowly, influence hardens into control. At home, England itself is changing. The 17th century brings civil war, the rise and fall of kings, and a new idea that the wealth of a nation can be built not only on land but on commerce. The English Channel, once a defensive moat, becomes the highway of empire. London grows into a city of ships and merchants, its docks crowded with cargo from every corner of the world. sugar from the Caribbean, furs from Canada, pepper from India. Yet this prosperity is built on a dark foundation. The triangular trade, goods from England exchanged for enslaved Africans who are then transported across the Atlantic to work in brutal plantations, becomes one of the engines of empire. Ships return to England laden with sugar, cotton and rum, their profits enriching merchants and financing further expansion. Entire cities, from Bristol to Liverpool, grow rich from this human misery. By the early 18th century, England, now united with Scotland as Great Britain, has emerged as a true imperial power. Colonies stretch across the Americas, Africa and Asia. The Royal Navy patrols the seas, ensuring that British goods and influence flow freely. But rivals still loom. France too dreams of global dominance. The struggle between them will become a series of world-spanning conflicts, fought not only in Europe, but in the jungles of India, the forests of Canada, and the Caribbean's turquoise waters. When the 7 Years' War breaks out in 1756, it is, in many ways, the first global war. On battlefields from Quebec to Bengal, British redcoats clash with French troops. Forts change hands, empires rise and fall, and when the war ends in 1763, the map of the world is redrawn. Britain stands triumphant. France has lost Canada and India's richest territories. The seas belong to the Union Jack. In just over 2 centuries, the island that once feared invasion has become the master of oceans. Its merchants, explorers and soldiers now reach every corner of the globe. But beneath the triumph lies tension, ambition that will stretch the empire to its breaking point. For as Britain expands outward, it must hold together an empire of countless peoples, faiths and tongues. And though it seems unstoppable, the seeds of challenge, rebellion, independence and war are already being sown. The sun, as poets will later say, never sets on the British Empire, but even the brightest sun must cast long shadows. The middle of the 18th century was a time of transformation, for the world, and for Britain most of all. What had begun as scattered colonies and trading posts was now beginning to resemble something far greater. An empire not of accident, but of design. The seas carried more than goods, they carried ambition. Every ship that left London or Bristol, every charter signed by a royal hand, was a step toward dominion. Across the Atlantic, the British colonies in North America had grown from fragile footholds to thriving societies. The forests that once seemed endless were now dotted with towns, farms, and bustling ports. Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, all were living symbols of English enterprise. Their streets echoed with the accents of Britain, their laws were written in English ink, and yet beneath the surface they were beginning to grow restless. For the empire, North America was a jewel, a land of abundance of timber, tobacco, and fur. But to the settlers who lived there, it was home. They saw themselves not as mere subjects of a distant king, but as something new, a people shaped by the frontier, independent and bold. The Atlantic that once connected them to England was slowly becoming a divide. While tension simmered in the west, the true heart of imperial ambition beat thousands of miles away, in the east. India, a land of kingdoms and empires older than England itself, had long been a place of wonder for European traders. Its spices perfumed their food, its silks clothed their nobles, its jewels adorned their crowns. The East India Company had been trading there for over a century, but by the mid-17th century trade alone was not enough. Profit demanded power, and power demanded soldiers. When the Mughal Empire, the great Islamic dynasty that had once ruled most of India, began to fracture, the British saw opportunity. Rival princes vied for control, and the company offered them what they needed most: guns, money, and men. The price was loyalty and access. Battles fought not by kings but by merchants began to decide the fate of nations. In 1757, on the humid plains of Bengal, The British under Robert Clive met the forces of the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey. What followed was not merely a victory, it was a transformation. Through cunning alliances, bribery, and a storm that scattered the Nawab's army, Clive triumphed. The East India Company became the master of Bengal, one of the richest provinces in Asia. In that single moment, a corporation began to rule a country. Back in Britain, news of Clive's victory was met with astonishment. Gold and silk poured into London. Investors grew rich overnight. But beneath the glitter lay something darker, the quiet birth of a colonial bureaucracy, the slow tightening of British rule over millions of people who had never seen England, nor asked to be governed by it. While India was being conquered in boardrooms and battlefields, another drama unfolded across the Atlantic. The American colonies, proud and prosperous, began to question the authority of the Crown. Taxes imposed from London, on tea, on stamps, on paper, were seen not as law, but as tyranny. What began as protest turned into defiance. In Boston Harbor, barrels of tea were hurled into the sea. In Philadelphia, delegates gathered to declare that a people have the right to govern themselves. The British, confident in their might, believed rebellion could be crushed. Red-coated soldiers marched under the Union Jack, sure of victory. But across the fields of Lexington and Concord, a new army was rising, an army of farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen, led by a tall Virginian named George Washington. The war that followed shook the empire to its core. For the first time, Britain faced not a rival nation, but its own creation turned against it. Year after year the conflict dragged on, from the frozen winters of Valley Forge to the burning streets of Yorktown. And when the guns fell silent in 1783, the impossible had happened. The 13 colonies were gone. It was a humiliation unlike any Britain had ever known. The empire that had seemed destined to dominate the New World had lost it. But defeat did not end ambition. It merely redirected it. While the Atlantic slipped from their grasp, the British turned their gaze eastward once more. In India, the East India Company tightened its grip, expanding from Bengal into the heart of the subcontinent. Its private armies, larger than those of many European states, marched under the company's flag, but in truth they served the interests of empire. Local rulers who resisted were defeated, their lands annexed. Those who cooperated found themselves puppets in British hands. Forts rose on riverbanks, cannons guarded trading posts, and taxes flowed back to London like a tide. The wealth of the East became the wealth of the West. Tea from Assam, cotton from Gujarat, indigo from Bengal, all fed the factories of industrial Britain. The Industrial Revolution itself, which was now transforming the island at home, was fueled by the riches of empire. The steam engine, the spinning jenny, the iron ship, all were born from the profits of colonies thousands of miles away. Yet empire was not only built by soldiers and merchants, it was carried by explorers, missionaries, and map-makers, men who drew borders across lands they barely understood. In Africa, British ships sailed up great rivers like the Niger and the Zambezi, charting territories and establishing trading posts. In the Pacific, Captain James Cook explored the unknown reaches of the world, claiming Australia and New Zealand in the name of King George. By the dawn of the 19th century, the British Empire had transformed again, from a mercantile network into a global system of control. The defeat of Napoleon in 1815 left Britain supreme on the seas. The Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force the world had ever seen, became both sword and shield of the empire. Its ships enforced trade, crushed piracy, and ensured that British goods, and British power, reached every corner of the globe. The empire's reach was now staggering. From the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the coasts of Africa, from the deserts of Arabia to the jungles of Burma, Britain's flag flew high. London became the centre of the world, its banks, its ports, its parliament dictating the rhythm of nations. To many Britons, it seemed as though their empire was the natural order of things, that God himself had destined them to rule, but not everyone shared in the glory. In India, famine and rebellion simmered beneath the surface. In Africa, treaties signed under duress turned ancient lands into British protectorates, and in the Caribbean, the cries of enslaved people echoed through the fields of sugarcane. By the early 1800s, a new moral wind began to stir. Across Britain, abolitionists demanded an end to the slave trade. Men like William Wilberforce stood before Parliament and argued that empire could not be built on human suffering. Their campaign, slow and bitterly fought, finally triumphed in 1807 when the slave trade was outlawed. Yet even as Britain condemned slavery at sea, it continued to profit from empire on land. The British Empire, now vast beyond imagining, was both a triumph and a contradiction, a force that claimed to bring civilization and commerce, yet often imposed domination and misery. And as the 19th century unfolded, that contradiction would grow. For every new colony conquered, every new invention born in British factories, there would be resistance, from peoples who refused to be ruled, and from within Britain itself, as voices began to ask whether the empire's reach had exceeded its grasp. For now, though, the empire stood at its zenith. Its navy ruled the waves, its merchants ruled the markets, and its map-makers with confident hands painted nearly a quarter of the world in red. But empires, like tides, rise and fall. The sea that had once carried England to greatness would one day carry its power away again. The 19th century dawned with the thunder of industry and the hum of empire. In the smoky streets of London, soot-stained chimneys belched clouds into a grey sky, and beneath them, factories roared with the power of steam. Britain was no longer merely a nation, it was a machine, vast and relentless, turning the raw materials of its colonies into the wealth of the world. Cotton from India and Egypt spun through Lancashire's mills. Coal mined from the hills of Wales fed iron foundries that forged rails and cannons. Ships loaded with British textiles, tools and guns sailed outward in endless procession, and in return came sugar, tea, gold, ivory, and the labour of countless unseen hands. The empire had become a system, one that bound continents together in a web of commerce, control, and dependency. In 1837, a young queen ascended the throne. Victoria, small, determined, and barely 18, would reign longer than any monarch before her, and under her crown, the British Empire would reach its apogee. She inherited not just a kingdom, but a vision, a belief that Britain's destiny was global, that its civilization, its laws, and its language were gifts to be carried to the corners of the earth. To her subjects, she was not merely a ruler, but a symbol of stability, progress, and empire itself. Across Britain, pride in imperial power became a national faith. Newspapers chronicled the exploits of explorers, missionaries, and generals with breathless admiration. Schoolchildren were taught that they belonged to the greatest empire in history, that while other nations fought for scraps, the British ruled with justice, mercy, and strength. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," became not just a boast, but a conviction. Yet behind the polished image of the empire, the reality was far more complex. In India, resentment simmered beneath the surface of British rule. The East India Company, having grown from a trading house into a sovereign power, now governed more than 100 million people. Its officials, men of ambition, often young and far from home, imposed British laws, collected taxes, and lived like princes in the shadow of ancient civilizations. To the British, their presence was a mission of order and reform. To many Indians, it was domination and exploitation. The company's policies disrupted traditional society. Land was confiscated, rulers were deposed, and soldiers of all faiths were forced to serve foreign masters. The tension built silently for decades, until in 1857 it exploded. It began as a mutiny among Indian soldiers, sepoys, in the company's army, sparked by rumours that rifle cartridges were greased with the fat of cows and pigs, an insult to both Hindu and Muslim beliefs. But the mutiny became something larger, a rebellion, a cry of anger against British rule itself. Cities rose in revolt, and for a moment it seemed the empire might crumble in the very land that sustained it. The conflict was brutal beyond imagining. In Delhi, Kanpur and Lucknow, massacres and reprisals followed one another in waves of vengeance. Villages burned, armies marched, and thousands died. When the rebellion was finally crushed, the East India Company was finished. The British Crown took direct control of India, and Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876. The Raj, as it came to be known, was the jewel of the empire, a vast domain of princes and peasants, railways and palaces, all under the watchful eye of Britain. For many in London, it was proof of divine purpose that the British were the chosen stewards of civilization. But in the crowded streets of Calcutta and Bombay, the empire's glitter looked different. Famine struck again and again, worsened by rigid economic policies. Millions starved while grain was exported overseas. The same railways that symbolized progress also carried death and exile. While India bore the weight of imperial rule, new horizons opened elsewhere. In Africa, a continent long known to Europe only by its coasts, explorers like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley ventured deep into the interior, mapping rivers, mountains and kingdoms unknown to the West. Their journeys, wrapped in the language of discovery and faith, paved the way for something far less noble, the scramble for Africa. By the 1880s, European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and others, were racing to carve up the continent like spoils of war. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, diplomats drew lines across maps of Africa with rulers and pens, dividing lands they had never seen and people they had never met. To the British it was destiny, to Africans it was invasion. From Egypt to South Africa, British flags were raised over deserts and savannas, over gold mines and river deltas. The empire grew not by accident but by design, through treaties, wars, and the relentless advance of trade. In Egypt, British troops occupied Cairo to protect the Suez Canal, the vital artery that connected Europe to India and the East. In Sudan, they fought Mahdist rebels in battles that became legend. The death of General Gordon at Khartoum, the revenge at Omdurman. Far to the south, in the lands of the Zulu and the Boer, the empire's ambition collided with fierce resistance. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 brought stunning early defeats for Britain. The massacre at Isandlwana, where Zulu warriors armed with spears overwhelmed British regulars, followed by bloody retaliation. Then came the Boer Wars, fought against Dutch settlers who refused British control. These conflicts, fought in dusty hills and sun-scorched plains, tested the empire's might and its conscience. At home, the empire was both celebrated and questioned. Industrial Britain was changing rapidly. The wealth of empire built great cities, railways and schools, but also deep inequality. In London's East End, children starved while ships brought gold and silk from abroad. Writers like Charles Dickens and later George Orwell would expose the shadows behind imperial pride, the grinding poverty that empire's riches could not conceal. Yet for many, the empire was a source of hope and belonging. Millions of men and women across Britain's dominions, in Canada, Australia and New Zealand, saw themselves as part of a great family, bound by language and law. They fought in Britain's wars, traded under her flag, and sang songs of loyalty to a monarch they would never meet. The empire had become not just a political entity, but an identity. Technology strengthened that identity. The telegraph, stretching across oceans and continents, allowed messages to travel from London to Bombay in minutes. Steamships carried mail, goods, and people faster than ever before. Railways laced the colonies together, symbols of progress and power. To Victorians, it seemed as though time and distance themselves had bowed before Britain's will. But empire was never only about control. It was also about imagination, about how Britons saw themselves and how they wanted the world to see them. Writers and artists filled magazines with stories of adventure, discovery, and heroism. Missionaries preached salvation in the jungles of Africa and the villages of Asia. Scientists classified plants, animals, and peoples, often reducing entire cultures to curiosities. The British Empire did not just conquer the world, it defined it, naming, measuring, and cataloguing everything it touched. By the late 19th century, at the height of Queen Victoria's reign, the empire spanned the globe: Canada in the north, Australia in the south, India, the crown jewel, Egypt, the gateway to Africa, Hong Kong, the doorway to China. Even remote islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean bore the Union Jack. A quarter of humanity lived under British rule. To many it seemed eternal. But even as Britain stood astride the world, new challenges were rising. In Europe, rival powers, Germany, France, and Russia, were industrializing fast, building armies and fleets that could challenge Britain's supremacy. In the colonies, educated elites began to speak of freedom and equality, of nations that might one day stand on their own. The empire's foundations, built on trade, pride, and power, were strong but not unshakable. And beneath the triumphal parades and glittering banquets, a quieter truth began to emerge: that the very forces which had made the British Empire so vast were now setting the stage for its greatest test. The century that had begun with the hum of industry and the confidence of conquest would end in fire, in a world war that would engulf the globe the empire once claimed to rule. The story of the British Empire in the 19th century is not merely a tale of conquests and colonies. It is the story of a nation transformed by its own ambition, of an island kingdom that looked outward and saw the world not as distant and foreign, but as a stage upon which it was destined to act. And in the early decades of that century, Britain seemed unstoppable. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything. It began quietly, in the hum of spinning wheels, the hiss of steam, the glow of molten iron, but its echoes spread across the world. For centuries, wealth had depended on land, on the slow rhythms of harvest and trade. Now, machines created wealth faster than empires could count it. The cotton that grew in the sweltering fields of Bengal or the American South found its way to the mills of Manchester and Liverpool, where endless rows of whirring looms turned it into cloth. The coal from Welsh mines fed furnaces that burned day and night, powering steam engines that drove ships and trains across continents. Smoke poured into the sky, black, thick, unending, until even the rain that fell over London turned grey. Yet, to the Victorians, this was not pollution, but progress. The chimneys were symbols of triumph, the smoke a kind of national banner, proof that Britain was fulfilling its destiny. Cities swelled as people flooded in from the countryside, drawn by the promise of work. For every factory that rose, another farm emptied. London became the beating heart of the empire, a city that seemed to contain the world within its streets. On the docks of the Thames, sailors unloaded goods from every corner of the globe. Tea from Ceylon, coffee from Jamaica, opium from India, ivory from Africa, the cargoes of empire piled high beside the river. In the markets, Londoners could sip Chinese tea from Indian cups while reading newspapers printed on Canadian paper. The empire was no longer distant. It was inside their homes, on their tables, woven into their lives. But the empire did not enrich everyone equally. For every wealthy merchant or factory owner, there were hundreds who lived in poverty. In the East End of London, entire families slept in single rooms. Children worked long hours in textile mills, and disease spread faster than medicine could keep up. To them, the glory of empire was something seen only in newspapers, distant, glittering, and cruelly out of reach. Still, pride in empire ran deep. It gave people a sense of belonging, of purpose. Even the poor might say, "We may be hungry, but we belong to the greatest nation on earth." It was an idea that stitched the classes together, that Britain's greatness was shared, even if its riches were not. And far from home, the empire continued to expand. In India, the East India Company ruled like a kingdom unto itself. It minted its own coins, commanded its own armies, and made its own laws. Its officials dressed in fine linen, dined on imported wine, and sent home fortunes drawn from taxes and trade. But beneath the surface, discontent grew. The Indian sepoys, native soldiers trained and armed by the company, began to murmur among themselves. They were paid less than their British counterparts, treated as inferior, and forced to serve far from home. When word spread that new rifle cartridges were greased with animal fat forbidden by their religions, outrage erupted. In May of 1857, the spark became flame. The mutiny began at Meerut and spread like wildfire across the plains of northern India. In Delhi, the old Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar was proclaimed a figurehead of rebellion. For a moment, it seemed as though the British might lose everything. The fighting was fierce and merciless. In the narrow streets of Indian cities, gunfire echoed between mosques and temples. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, their lives torn apart by the clash of empire and uprising. At Cawnpore, hundreds were massacred, their deaths avenged tenfold by British troops. Villages were burned, rebels were executed, and the soil of India was soaked in blood. When the rebellion was finally crushed, the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands lay dead. The East India Company was abolished, its power transferred directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria issued a proclamation promising justice, tolerance, and reform. But India had changed, and so had Britain. The rebellion taught the empire a harsh lesson, that power, once taken for granted, could be challenged. In the decades that followed, the British tightened their grip on India. The army was reorganised, the civil service expanded, and railways carved steel lines across the subcontinent. To the British, these were marks of progress. To many Indians, they were chains. The Raj became both a marvel and a prison, a place where palaces rose beside slums, and where British officials governed with cold precision from whitewashed offices. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the empire had become more than just policy. It was identity. In drawing rooms and taverns alike, people spoke of faraway lands with the familiarity of neighbours. The names of distant colonies rolled easily off the tongue: Bombay, Cairo, Cape Town, Singapore. Each name carried with it an image, a fantasy, of jungles tamed, deserts crossed, and foreign peoples enlightened by British hands. The newspapers were full of such stories. The adventures of explorers and soldiers filled the pages with glory. When David Livingstone vanished in the heart of Africa, the world waited breathlessly for news, and when Henry Morton Stanley found him years later, his famous words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," echoed across continents. Yet behind these tales of discovery lay a harsher truth. Every map drawn, every border claimed was another piece of the world taken. In Africa, the British were not alone. The French, Germans, Belgians, and Portuguese all scrambled for territory, carving up the continent with treaties and rifles. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 divided Africa into spheres of influence, without a single African voice in the room. Rivers, mountains, and peoples were split apart by lines drawn on paper in faraway Europe. For Britain, the prize was vast. From Egypt in the north to the Cape in the south, the dream of a red line of colonies stretching across the continent became an imperial obsession, the vision of a British Africa from Cairo to Cape Town. In pursuit of this dream, soldiers and administrators fanned out across the land. They built forts, railways, and telegraph lines. They signed treaties, sometimes fair, often forced, and fought wars against kingdoms that resisted. In Sudan, British and Egyptian troops faced the armies of the Mahdi, a Muslim leader who declared holy war against foreign rule. The siege of Khartoum in 1885 and the death of General Charles Gordon became a national tragedy in Britain. His stiff upper lip turned to legend. In South Africa, the Zulu kingdom, proud and disciplined, defied British demands. At Isandlwana, British forces met one of their most shocking defeats. Thousands of redcoats cut down by Zulu spears. Yet Britain's retaliation was swift and overwhelming, and by the war's end, Zulu land lay under imperial control. But victory bred new challenges. The Boers, Dutch-descended settlers who had founded independent republics in the interior, resented British interference. Tensions erupted into the Boer Wars, where Britain found itself fighting a modern, European-style enemy in the African veldt. The Boers fought fiercely, using guerrilla tactics that confounded British troops. In frustration, the British responded with harsh measures, scorched earth policies, and the creation of concentration camps where thousands of civilians suffered and died. When the war finally ended in 1902, the cost was immense. The Empire had won, but at the expense of its own reputation. For the first time, voices in Britain began to question whether empire was truly a moral force, or merely a mask for greed and control. And yet, the machinery of empire rolled on. New colonies were established. New markets opened. In London, the empire was celebrated with exhibitions that dazzled the public. Great halls filled with artifacts, animals, and people brought from across the globe, displayed as living proof of Britain's dominion. To many, it seemed unthinkable that such power could ever fade, but already the signs were there, faint, subtle, but undeniable. The cracks in the marble, the tremors beneath the foundation. In India, a new class of educated men began to speak of self-rule. In Ireland, demands for independence grew louder. Across the empire, the people Britain claimed to civilize began to ask what right it had to rule them at all. The 19th century had been Britain's golden age, an age of iron and empire, of factories and flags. But as the century turned, a new and uncertain world was dawning. The rival empires of Europe were arming themselves, their ambitions clashing like storms on the horizon. And when that storm finally broke, it would not merely test Britain's strength, it would shake the very foundations of its empire. When the summer of 1914 arrived, Britain stood at the height of its power. The sun still never set on its dominions, and the red of the empire's flag still coloured every map from Canada to India, from Australia to Africa. In London, the streets were alive with the confidence of empire. Electric trams rattling down crowded avenues, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and progress. To the British public, the empire was not a burden but a birthright, the natural order of the world. But that summer, the world changed forever. A gunshot in Sarajevo set in motion a chain of events that would drag empires into chaos. When Britain declared war on Germany, it did so with the calm assurance of a power that had always prevailed. Men lined up to enlist, cheering as they marched through the streets. Posters promised glory and adventure. Your king and country need you. They did not yet understand what kind of war this would be. From the ports of India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and across Africa, ships departed carrying men who had never seen Europe but were now being sent to die for it. They came wearing turbans, wide-brimmed hats, and rough khaki uniforms. They spoke a dozen languages and prayed to different gods, but they marched under the same flag. In the mud of France, that flag soon turned brown with dirt and blood. The trenches stretched for hundreds of miles, a world of wire and rats, of gas and shell fire. The Empire's sons fought shoulder to shoulder and died side by side. Indian sepoys at Neuve Chapelle, Canadian troops at Vimy Ridge, Australians at Gallipoli, Newfoundlanders at the Somme. For every victory, the cost was unbearable. Those who survived carried the weight of what they had seen, and the question of why. Why had men from Bengal or Punjab, from Kenya or Jamaica, been made to die in a European war? Britain promised that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. In speeches and newspapers, politicians spoke of a new world that would follow, a world of equality, justice, and self-determination. But when the guns finally fell silent in 1918, that promise began to crumble. The Empire was victorious, but victory had come at a price too great to measure. Nearly 1 million soldiers from the colonies had served. Tens of thousands had died. Yet the rewards of peace were not shared. In India, returning veterans were greeted not with gratitude, but with suspicion. Economic hardship deepened, and when peaceful protests demanded reform, they were met with brutality. In 1919, in the city of Amritsar, British troops opened fire on a crowd of unarmed men, women and children. The massacre sent shockwaves across the subcontinent, a moment when millions realised that the Empire's talk of justice was a lie. The illusion of benevolent rule began to falter. In Ireland, long-simmering resentment erupted into rebellion, and by 1922 Britain was forced to accept the creation of the Irish Free State, a wound that would never fully heal. In Egypt, in Kenya, in the Caribbean, voices of resistance grew louder. Yet even as the Empire trembled, life in Britain tried to return to normal. The 1920s were a decade of uneasy glamour. London streets filled with jazz and motorcars, women cut their hair short, and the old aristocratic world began to fade. But beneath the bright lights was exhaustion, a weariness that came from knowing the old certainties were slipping away. The Empire had grown during the war, taking new territories from the defeated powers, German East Africa, parts of the Middle East, new protectorates that stretched Britain's reach farther than ever before. But in truth, the Empire was beginning to overextend itself. Governing half the world required not just armies and ships, but money, loyalty, and belief, and all three were in decline. Then came the crash. In 1929, the Great Depression spread like a shadow across the globe. Markets collapsed, banks failed, and millions lost their jobs. In the colonies, the effects were devastating. The prices of raw materials, the lifeblood of imperial trade, plummeted. Farmers in India and Africa starved while their goods went unsold. For Britain, the Empire had long been a source of wealth and stability. Now it became a burden, expensive to maintain, impossible to reform. And yet, it remained the heart of Britain's identity. In schoolbooks and films, children were still told that Britain's flag was a symbol of freedom and progress, that its mission was to bring civilization to the world. The Empire, even in crisis, still wrapped itself in moral certainty. But history was moving faster than Empire could follow. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Britain once again found itself at war, and this time, the very survival of the free world seemed to hang in the balance. The Second World War was not just fought by Britain, it was fought by its empire. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, soldiers from across the colonies stood in the front lines. Indian divisions fought in North Africa and Italy. West African regiments marched through the Burmese jungle. Caribbean pilots flew in the Royal Air Force. The Empire became a global army, united not by choice, but by circumstance. Back in Britain, the Blitz turned cities into ruins. London burned night after night under German bombs, yet the people endured. Amid the rubble, they sang, they joked, they carried on. That stubborn endurance became part of the national legend, the spirit of the Blitz, the unyielding heart of the British people. But it was not only Britain that endured. In the colonies, loyalty to the Empire was tested as never before. Propaganda urged them to fight for freedom. But what did freedom mean to those who lived under imperial rule? Many fought bravely, believing the war might lead to a better future. Yet as the years passed, that hope began to fade. When the war finally ended in 1945, Britain once again stood among the victors. But the victory was hollow. The empire had survived the war, but Britain itself was exhausted. Its cities were in ruins, its treasury empty, its people weary. And more than that, the world had changed. Across Asia and Africa, a new idea was rising. The idea that empire itself was obsolete. The colonies that had fought for Britain now demanded independence. India led the way. In 1947, after centuries of British rule, India won its freedom. The joy of independence was tempered by tragedy, partition, bloodshed, and displacement on a scale the world had never seen. But for the British Empire, it was the beginning of the end. The loss of India was not just territorial, it was spiritual. The jewel in the crown was gone, and without it, the rest of the imperial structure began to crumble. One by one, nations that had once been ruled by Britain declared their independence: Burma, Ceylon, Ghana, Malaya, Nigeria, Kenya. In Africa, the struggle was long and bitter, sometimes peaceful, often violent. At home, Britain faced a different kind of reckoning. The empire had shaped its identity for centuries, but who was Britain without it? The post-war years were marked by austerity and reconstruction. Bombed-out streets were rebuilt, new welfare systems introduced, the National Health Service born from the rubble of war. Yet amid the rebuilding, a quiet melancholy settled in. The realization that Britain was no longer the centre of the world. The Suez Crisis of 1956 drove that truth home. When Britain, alongside France and Israel, tried to seize control of the Suez Canal after Egypt's nationalisation, the United States and the Soviet Union forced them to back down. The message was clear. The age of empire was over. The great imperial power that had once ruled the seas now needed permission to act. In the decades that followed, decolonisation accelerated. New flags replaced the Union Jack across Africa and Asia. Independence movements celebrated their freedom, while in Britain, nostalgia for the empire grew stronger. Old veterans spoke of the past with pride. School children still coloured maps in red, and politicians spoke of the Commonwealth as a family of nations, though the truth was far more complex. By the time the 1960s arrived, the British Empire, once the largest in history, had all but disappeared. Only fragments remained. Small islands, scattered territories, echoes of a vanished age. But its legacy endured everywhere, in languages, in borders, in laws, in conflicts still unresolved. And in Britain itself, the empire's end brought new questions. As immigrants from former colonies arrived to build new lives in the mother country, Britain began to see its past reflected in the faces of its future. The empire had come home, not as ruler, but as memory. In the years after the empire's fall, Britain entered a quiet kind of twilight. The war was over, the colonies were gone, and the world was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. Yet on the streets of London, Liverpool and Birmingham, the empire's echo was everywhere. Ships that had once carried goods from Bombay, Kingston and Lagos now brought people. Men and women from across the Commonwealth, from the Caribbean, from India and Pakistan, from Nigeria and Kenya, arrived seeking work, opportunity, and the promise of a better life. They came to rebuild the country that the war had left in ruins, to drive its buses, staff its hospitals, and keep its factories running. They called it the Windrush generation, named after the Empire Windrush, the ship that docked in 1948 carrying hundreds of Caribbean passengers to the port of Tilbury. They stepped onto British soil with optimism and pride, believing they were going to the heart of a land they had long been taught to admire. Many carried small Union Jacks in their hands, unaware that they were arriving in a country still uncertain of its place in the world, a country that looked at them too often with suspicion. For centuries, Britain had defined itself by its dominion over others, Now it struggled to define itself without one. The old maps that once glowed red in classrooms had turned pale and foreign. Children still recited stories of empire, but the meaning had changed. The words Great Britain no longer described a global ruler, but an island adjusting to its own smallness. Economically, the post-war years were harsh. The 1950s and 60s brought rationing, debt and decline, even as other nations, once colonised, now independent, began to rise. But there was also renewal. The welfare state, the NHS, and new housing estates symbolised a fresh beginning, a promise that Britain could rebuild itself not through conquest, but through care. Culturally, the world shifted beneath the empire's shadow. Music, film, and art began to question the myths of the past. Young people rejected the stuffy moralism of the old order. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and countless others gave voice to a generation that had grown up after the war, a generation that no longer saw the empire as glory, but as history. Yet the empire lingered in invisible ways. It lived in the shape of the English language, now spoken in classrooms and parliaments across continents. It lived in the legal systems of faraway nations, in cricket matches and postal services, in street names and statues that still bore the names of imperial heroes. And sometimes it lived in the quiet discomfort of remembrance, the reluctance to look too closely at the cruelty that had built the empire's wealth. Britain was proud of its role in abolishing slavery, yet slow to confront its role in creating it. It celebrated its explorers and adventurers, but rarely spoke of the millions who suffered under their flags. The 1970s and 80s brought new challenges. Britain's global influence continued to fade as the Cold War divided the world between two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The empire's successor, the Commonwealth, was meant to symbolize friendship and shared history, but it was a fragile idea. Some nations cherished the connection. Others viewed it as a lingering chain to be broken. In 1982, Britain found itself once again at war, not with a global rival, but with Argentina over a cluster of remote islands in the South Atlantic, the Falklands. The war was brief but fierce, and its outcome, a British victory, stirred something deep in the national consciousness. For a moment the old pride returned. Flags waved. Newspapers declared that Britain still had fight left in her. But beneath the celebration was a quiet truth. The empire was gone, and no war, however victorious, could bring it back. In the decades that followed, Britain reinvented itself again, not as an empire, but as a cultural powerhouse, a financial hub, a nation of memory and reinvention. London became one of the most diverse cities on earth, where mosques stood beside cathedrals, and street markets offered spices from every continent once ruled by the crown. The children of empire had become the citizens of Britain, shaping its food, its music, its politics. Still, the ghosts of empire lingered. They appeared in debates about immigration, about race, about identity. They whispered in the words British values, a phrase that could mean pride or prejudice, depending on who spoke it. They echoed in the museums filled with artifacts, treasures taken from colonies and never returned. In classrooms, the story of the empire was often told in fragments. Explorers and inventions, but not the famines, not the massacres, not the countless unnamed lives lost beneath the weight of imperial ambition. For many, empire was history. For others, it was a wound still healing. By the turn of the 21st century, the empire had been gone for half a century, but its legacy shaped everything. The global economy Britain had once dominated was now defined by nations that had once been its colonies: India, Australia, Canada, South Africa. English had become the language of global trade and diplomacy, an inheritance of empire both accidental and enduring. Yet Britain itself was changing again. The old certainties of national identity began to fray. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland sought greater autonomy. Immigration transformed towns and cities, blending cultures and traditions into something new, and unrecognisable to older generations. Some looked back on the empire with nostalgia, remembering its ships, its pageantry, its promise of greatness. Others looked back with anger, seeing only the exploitation, the blood, the theft that had built it. Between these two visions, Britain searched for meaning, for a story that could unite its past and its present. In 2016, that search took a dramatic turn. The vote to leave the European Union, Brexit, revealed a nation still haunted by its imperial shadow. For some, it was a call to reclaim independence, to restore the old sense of sovereignty. For others, it was a sign that Britain had never fully let go of its illusions of grandeur, the belief that it could stand alone, as it once had when the seas were red with its banners. The years that followed were turbulent. Political crises, cultural divides, and debates about empire's legacy filled the airwaves. Statues of imperial figures became flashpoints for protest. In Bristol, the statue of slave trader Edward Colston was torn down and thrown into the harbour, the same waters that had once carried his ships of human cargo. Across the nation, a reckoning began. Who were these men we had raised in bronze? What stories had we silenced to honour them? For some, these questions felt like betrayal, an attempt to erase history. For others, they were an awakening, a chance to see the empire not as myth, but as truth. The truth that Britain's greatness had been built on both brilliance and brutality, invention and oppression, courage and cruelty. As the 21st century deepened, Britain's global role continued to shift. It was no longer an empire, but neither was it a small island. Its influence persisted in culture, finance, language and law, subtle and invisible, like an echo fading but never gone. The Commonwealth, once a symbol of empire's continuity, evolved into something softer, a network of nations bound by shared history and pragmatic friendship, rather than loyalty to the crown. And through it all, the memory of empire remained, not in the old glory of conquests and coronations, but in quieter ways, in the faces of school children whose ancestors had come from every corner of the world, in the spices that flavoured British kitchens, in the cricket matches watched from Delhi to Kingston, in the accents that blended continents in a single sentence. The empire that had once ruled through force now existed as memory, myth, and influence. Its monuments stood weathered but unfallen. Its stories lived on, in pride, in pain, in argument. And perhaps that was the final paradox of the British Empire, that even after it ended it never truly disappeared. It lived on not in dominion, but in connection, in the strange, complex web of cultures that had once been conquered and now coexisted, bound not by rule, but by history. Today, when the British flag flies over foreign soil, it is not as a symbol of conquest, but of remembrance. The world it once ruled is independent yet interconnected. The empire that almost conquered the world has become something else, not a kingdom of land, but of language, ideas, and legacy. And yet, if one stands on the cliffs of Dover at sunset, watching the sea that once carried fleets to every corner of the earth, it is easy to feel the ghosts of that empire still moving in the wind. The sailors and merchants, the soldiers and dreamers, the millions who lived and died beneath the Union Jack. Their voices have faded, but their story remains, the story of how one small island reached out across the world and in doing so changed it forever. The empire is gone, the world it built remains. But history, as Britain learned, is not something that ends. It lingers, in habits, in words, in the quiet assumptions that shape how a nation sees itself. Even as the last colonies gained independence, the machinery of empire never fully stopped turning. It simply changed its form. In the decades after the 1960s, Britain learned to exercise a new kind of power, not through armies and governors, but through influence. The empire of trade and conquest gave way to an empire of ideas, of finance, of culture. London remained one of the beating hearts of the global economy. The city's old financial houses, once built on the profits of empire, now handled the wealth of the world in digital silence, money flowing faster than any fleet ever could. The pound sterling no longer ruled the world, but the systems it helped create, banking, insurance, global commerce, still bore the marks of British design. The empire's legacy had simply moved from the visible to the invisible. The same channels that once carried spices and cotton now carried capital and contracts. But influence also flowed in another way, through language. English, once imposed by conquest, had become the world's lingua franca. It was no longer simply British. It belonged to everyone. From Hong Kong to Nairobi, from Delhi to Toronto, English carried the rhythms of empire reshaped by 1,000 tongues. It was the most enduring legacy Britain ever created. A tool of power turned into a bridge. In film and television, in music and literature, the echoes of empire appeared again and again. British actors played kings and spies. Its musicians filled stadiums across continents. Its stories, from Dickens to Tolkien to J.K. Rowling, spread across the planet. Britain, small and often uncertain of its role, found that the world still listened when it spoke. And yet, beneath this soft power, there was unease. The empire had left behind not just connections, but contradictions. Many of the world's conflicts, and from borders drawn in haste to ethnic divisions nurtured by colonial rule, still bore the fingerprints of empire. The Middle East, South Asia, Africa, regions once coloured red on maps, now carried the scars of boundaries decided in London offices long ago. For some, Britain remained a symbol of order, law and civilization. For others, it was the architect of division, exploitation and theft. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, in the grey human spaces where history resists simple judgment. Inside Britain, the memory of empire began to surface in ways few had expected. In universities and museums, scholars and activists demanded a new kind of history, one that told the story from every side. They asked not just what Britain had built, but what it had taken. Not just what it had taught, but what it had silenced. Debates grew heated. Should colonial statues stand or fall? Should stolen artefacts be returned? Should schools teach the empire as glory or as warning? The conversation was not new. It had been whispered for decades, but now it filled the public square. At the same time, Britain's own sense of identity grew more complex. The nation that had once seen itself as the centre of the world now struggled to understand its place in a world that no longer needed it. The old certainties, that Britain was exceptional, chosen, destined for greatness, gave way to quieter questions. Who are we now, without the empire? And yet traces of imperial confidence still lingered in politics and imagination. The very idea of global Britain invoked in speeches and campaigns carried a faint echo of the old dream that this small island could still command a global stage, independent and proud. But reality was harder. The empire had once given Britain reach and wealth. Without it, the nation had to find new ways to matter. In the 21st century, that struggle played out in unexpected ways. British companies, banks, and universities became magnets for the children of the former empire. Students from India, Nigeria, Singapore, South Africa. They came seeking education, opportunity, and the prestige that had once been exported outward. The empire had reversed its direction. Now, the world came to Britain. In the streets of London, the legacy of that reversal was visible everywhere. The food, the faces, the sounds, all bore the imprint of empire returned. A century earlier, a British officer might have carried tea from Ceylon and spices from Bengal home in a trunk. Now, those same flavours came alive in every corner cafe. The empire had dissolved, but its world had gathered under one sky. Still, the weight of history never quite lifted. Britain's politicians spoke often of the special relationship with the United States, a phrase born of shared language and wartime alliance. But deep down, there was also recognition that the roles had changed. Britain had once been the empire upon which the sun never set. Now it was the junior partner in a new world order. Even so, the habits of empire persisted in subtler ways, in the confidence of diplomacy, in the structure of government, in the assumption that British institutions, British law, British manners still carried universal value. Sometimes they did, sometimes they did not, and while Britain adjusted to its new scale, the Commonwealth endured, a curious relic and experiment in post-imperial connection. It was not an empire, but neither was it entirely free of that shadow. For some nations, it was a family of equals. For others, a reminder of hierarchy never fully undone. Yet the meetings continued, the handshakes and speeches, the ceremonial warmth that hinted at old ties softened by time. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in the early 21st century marked another quiet turning point. She had reigned through the empire's last days and the long era of its memory, the last living thread to the age of colonies and coronations. For many across the Commonwealth, her passing symbolised the final fading of imperial Britain. Yet even in mourning, the old imagery returned. Processions, uniforms, the echo of imperial ritual that Britain could never quite forget. Beyond the pageantry, though, the world kept changing. New powers rose. China, India, Brazil. Nations once colonised or marginalised now reshaping the very systems that empire had built. The irony was not lost on anyone. The empire's greatest legacy might not be dominance, but the global world it had unintentionally created, a world connected by trade, migration, and memory. In classrooms, young Britons studied the history of the empire not as a distant saga of conquest, but as a mirror reflecting the present. Some felt pride in the achievements, in the railways, the inventions, the language that bound nations together. Others saw pain in the theft of land, the suppression of culture, the arrogance of power. And both were true. The empire had been both builder and destroyer, both teacher and tyrant. It had spread ideas of freedom even as it denied freedom to millions. It had united distant peoples while dividing them at home. Its story was not one of villains and heroes, but of human contradiction. Ambition mixed with cruelty, faith mixed with greed. In the end, the British Empire almost conquered the world, but it never quite conquered itself. It reached farther than any power before it, but it could not escape the truths of its own making. Yet perhaps, in a strange way, its reach still continues. In every corner of the planet the marks of empire endure, the railways of India, the parliaments of Africa, the courts of the Caribbean, the accents of English spoken in Lagos and Singapore, Sydney and Nairobi. The empire's monuments may have fallen, but its fingerprints remain everywhere, and so Britain carries on, no longer an empire but something smaller, stranger and perhaps wiser, a nation built on memory, walking through the ruins of its own greatness, still searching for what it means to be itself. But history never truly ends. It only changes its shape. And somewhere between the nostalgia for what was and the reckoning for what it cost, the story of Britain continues. The 21st century arrived not with the roar of cannon fire, but with the quiet hum of planes, cables and servers connecting the world in ways the old empire could never have imagined. And in that web of connection, the ghosts of empire stirred again, not as soldiers or rulers, but as travellers, traders, artists, and dreamers. Across the former colonies, the children and grandchildren of empire were rising. In India, the very land once ruled from London, a new generation of leaders, entrepreneurs, and scientists looked outward, confident, ambitious, global. The British had once come to teach and govern. Now, India sent engineers, doctors, and CEOs who would shape the future of technology and commerce. Silicon Valley spoke with accents from Mumbai and Bangalore. The empire's classroom had outgrown its master. In Africa, too, the story turned. Nations once carved up and exploited began to find new rhythms of independence. Lagos and Nairobi became tech capitals, their startups connecting local talent to global markets. Ghana, Kenya, South Africa all spoke the language of opportunity in English, but on their own terms. The empire's language had survived, but the power behind it had changed hands. The Caribbean, once a plantation system built on forced labour, had transformed into a diaspora of creativity and influence. From reggae to hip-hop to the London grime scene, Caribbean voices reshaped the very culture of the empire's old heartland. In London's Notting Hill Carnival, steel drums echoed through streets that had once belonged to another age. The colonised had brought their colour, their rhythm, their defiance to the centre of the old empire. And yet, the relationship was never simple. For many, Britain remained both the architect of opportunity and the shadow of loss. The migration that filled Britain's cities brought with it a sense of unfinished business, a reminder that history's debts are not easily repaid. In the 1950s and 60s, the Empire Windrush had carried workers from the Caribbean to rebuild a war-torn Britain. They came as citizens of the Commonwealth, with hope in their hearts. But decades later, their children and grandchildren still faced questions of belonging, still felt the chill of a country unsure whether to see them as guests or heirs. It was the same in other corners of the old empire. Pakistanis in Birmingham, Nigerians in Manchester, Indians in Leicester. Each carried fragments of empire's past into Britain's present. Their food, their festivals, their music, their languages became part of the national story. Curry replaced roast beef as the country's favourite dish. Diwali lights glowed beside Christmas trees. Britain had once gone out to conquer the world. Now the world had come home to Britain. But the weight of empire also pressed inward, shaping politics and identity in ways both visible and unseen. The Brexit referendum in 2016, though about the European Union, was haunted by the ghost of empire. Many who voted to take back control were, perhaps unknowingly, reaching for something older, the memory of an independent global Britain that needed no continent to define it. The slogans were modern, but the sentiment was ancient. Somewhere in the back of the national mind lingered the idea that Britain was still exceptional, still destined to stand alone, as it once had when its ships ruled the seas. Yet the world had moved on. Trade routes no longer depended on wind and canvas, and power no longer came from colonies, but from data, alliances, and innovation. Britain, for all its pride, had to find a new way to navigate this modern ocean, not as master, but as participant. The map had changed, but perhaps the journey had not. Meanwhile, across the former empire, the British legacy continued to evolve in unexpected forms. In India's courts, judges still quoted British legal precedents written 2 centuries earlier. In Kenya and Nigeria, the education systems mirrored the one once exported from Oxford and Cambridge. In Australia, the Union Jack still shared a place on the flag, and in Canada the monarchy remained, not as ruler, but as symbol, a thread connecting the Commonwealth to its distant origin. But perhaps the most surprising survival of empire lay not in politics, but in culture. The British imagination, shaped by centuries of exploration and empire, continued to project itself onto the world. From James Bond to Doctor Who, from The Crown to Downton Abbey, British media presented a vision of elegance, wit, and power that the world could not quite let go of. Even as Britain's real influence shrank, its cultural shadow stretched farther than ever. The empire that once ruled by muskets now ruled by story. And stories, unlike empires, do not fall, they adapt. Through the lens of time, historians began to see the empire less as a single nation's project, and more as a shared, tangled human story. a global experiment in contact and collision. It had brought immense suffering, yes, slavery, exploitation, the destruction of cultures, but it had also created a network of exchange and identity that defied easy moral judgment. The empire was a machine of power, but also a crucible of connection. In a London classroom, a teacher explained to her students how the British Empire had once covered a quarter of the globe. A hand rose in the back. A child with roots in Jamaica asked, "So, am I part of that empire too?" And in that question lay the truth of it all. The empire was not something in the past. It lived in every person whose story had been shaped by its reach. Britain itself had become a reflection of the world it once ruled, a mosaic of voices, histories, and faiths. The empire had ended, but its world had not. Every shop sign written in Urdu, every Nigerian church in London, every Indian restaurant in Birmingham, every West Indian family in Manchester, all were the empire's afterlife, walking and breathing. And yet, for all this, Britain remained haunted by nostalgia. Old films played scenes of imperial adventure, officers in khaki, explorers on distant shores, as if to remind a restless nation of when it had mattered more. Some saw that nostalgia as harmless pride, others as dangerous amnesia. But perhaps both were true. For nations, like people, remember their youth with both fondness and guilt. Today, the British flag still flies in places far from home, on islands, military bases and embassies. But its meaning has changed. No longer a symbol of dominion, it is now one of memory, of a world built, broken, and rebuilt again. The empire's greatest paradox is that it created a world that no longer needs it. The global systems it invented, free trade, maritime law, modern governance, outlived the empire itself. In that sense, Britain both won and lost. It achieved what it set out to do. It shaped the modern world. But in doing so, it erased the need for its own supremacy. Still, the old pulse of empire beats faintly beneath the surface. In the ambition of its cities, the self-assurance of its diplomacy, the quiet pride of its ceremonies. Britain may be smaller now, but it remains large in imagination. Its past gives it a voice that the world still hears, even when it no longer commands. Perhaps that is the final evolution of empire, not domination but influence, not control but conversation. And as Britain walks through the 21st century, a nation of poets and politicians, immigrants and monarchs, tradition and change, it carries with it the long shadow of empire. Not as burden, perhaps, but as reminder. That greatness, once claimed by conquest, must now be earned by understanding. The sun may have set on the empire, but its light, refracted through centuries, still glows on the horizon of history. The story of the British Empire does not end with retreat or withdrawal. It continues in the voices of the nations it left behind, in their struggles, their triumphs, and their reinventions. For though the empire once sought to shape the world in its own image, it was, in the end, changed by the very people it ruled. Let us begin where the empire's shadow was longest, in India. When the Union Jack was lowered over Delhi in 1947, the air trembled with both celebration and sorrow. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, singing songs of independence. But for every cheer, there was a cry. The partition of India and Pakistan split families, villages, entire regions apart. Trains rolled through the night carrying refugees, Hindus one way, Muslims the other, their carriages heavy with silence and grief. The empire had ended, but the lines it drew in haste would bleed for generations. And yet, from this chaos rose something extraordinary. India, a land of hundreds of languages, castes and creeds, chose democracy. It inherited from the British not just railways and bureaucracy, but the idea, imperfect though it was, that power could rest in institutions, not individuals. Over time, India transformed the tools of empire into the instruments of self-rule. The English language, once a symbol of subjugation, became a bridge between its peoples. The civil service, once designed to serve colonial masters, now served 1 billion citizens. In the decades that followed, India's influence grew quietly but surely. Its doctors and engineers fanned out across the globe. Its writers filled libraries with new voices, and in the heart of London, the descendants of once colonised families became mayors, parliamentarians, business leaders. The student had become the teacher. The colony, in many ways, had remade the metropole. Across the Indian Ocean, in the vastness of Africa, the British Empire had left another kind of legacy. From Cairo to Cape Town, it had drawn borders that ignored tribes, rivers and histories, artificial lines that would later spark wars and revolutions. But Africa was not simply a passive canvas on which empire had painted its will. Beneath the weight of colonial rule, movements of resistance had always existed, from the Zulu and the Ashanti to the Mau Mau in Kenya. When independence came, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Tanzania, it came like the breaking of a dam. The winds of freedom swept across the continent in the 1950s and 60s. Flags changed, anthems were written, and leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta stood before cheering crowds, promising a new dawn. But freedom carried the heavy inheritance of empire. Economies built for extraction, political systems borrowed but untested, borders that divided more than they united. Still, Africa endured and evolved. The same English that once silenced native tongues became the language of unity and education. In time, Lagos, Nairobi and Accra would grow into centres of innovation and art. African authors, Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, reclaimed the story, writing in the language of their former rulers but speaking with their own voice. And in British universities, young Africans studied law, medicine and politics, not to serve the empire but to build nations of their own. Across the Atlantic, the Caribbean had long been the empire's beating heart of sugar and sorrow. For centuries, its plantations had fueled Britain's wealth, built on the backs of enslaved Africans. When slavery was finally abolished in the 19th century, freedom did not bring equality. The islands remained poor, dependent, their soil worked out, their people struggling under the weight of history. But from struggle came strength. In the 20th century, the Caribbean gave Britain something the empire had never expected: renewal. The Windrush generation arrived after World War II to rebuild a nation bombed and weary. They brought warmth, music and labour, filling the factories, hospitals and transport systems. Yet they were met not with gratitude, but with suspicion and prejudice. Over decades they fought for their rights, their dignity, and their place in the country they had been taught was their own. Today, the rhythm of Britain beats in syncopation with the Caribbean. Reggae, calypso and soca became part of British soundtracks. Writers like Andrea Levy and Linton Kwesi Johnson turned memory into art. The story of the Caribbean is no longer one of enslavement, but of survival and contribution. And then there were the settler colonies, the white dominions where British emigrants had remade fragments of home. In Canada, Australia and New Zealand, the empire took on a different face. These were not conquered lands in the same way as India or Africa, though they were built too upon the dispossession of indigenous peoples. In Canada, British and French legacies blended uneasily. The maple leaf now flies where once the Union Jack did, yet the Queen's image still graces its currency. Its laws, language and institutions carry traces of Westminster, even as its identity has grown distinctly Canadian. In Australia, the empire began as a prison, a dumping ground for Britain's unwanted. Convicts built the first roads and farms, watched by red-coated soldiers under a pitiless sun. Yet from that harsh beginning rose a nation that saw itself as both British and not. The language, the cricket, the flag, all spoke of empire. But beneath it all, the Aboriginal peoples, dispossessed and displaced, told another story, one of endurance, of belonging to the land long before Britain claimed it. Today, Australia wrestles with that past, seeking reconciliation and truth. New Zealand's tale, too, carries echoes of the Empire's contradictions. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840 between the British Crown and Maori chiefs, was meant to bring peace and partnership. Yet its promises were soon broken. Land was taken, wars were fought, culture suppressed, and still, the Maori endured. In the modern age, their language and traditions have re-emerged, woven back into the national fabric. The Empire had sought to erase them. Instead, they have helped define what New Zealand is today. And across the oceans, another dominion grew into its own, South Africa. The British had come there in pursuit of gold, diamonds, and Empire's glory, clashing with the Dutch-descended Boers and subjugating native Africans. In time, apartheid would cast its long, cruel shadow, using the language and laws of empire to divide a people by race. But even that system would fall, undone by the courage of those who refused to bow. When Nelson Mandela walked free and later became president, it was more than a political victory. It was the final act in the long, brutal drama of colonial power. Each of these nations, India, Nigeria, Jamaica, Australia, Canada, South Africa, carried something of Britain with them, yet each transformed it into something new. The Empire had tried to impose a single story upon the world. In the end, it created a chorus. And that chorus, in turn, reshaped Britain. In the markets of London, you can hear a dozen languages in a single street. The smells of curry, jerk chicken, jollof rice, and dim sum mingle in the air. The empire that once sent ships to every corner of the world has become the harbour of that same world. Its people, its food, its music, its words, all the threads of empire woven back into the island that first cast them out. The British Empire may have been built on power, but what remains of it is connection, a strange, imperfect human web that ties continents together. And so, the story goes on. For though the empire itself is gone, the world it created, globalized, interlinked, in constant motion, is still very much alive. Empires do not simply vanish when the maps are redrawn. They linger in the stories people tell, in the buildings that line their streets, in the words they speak without thinking. And in Britain, the empire remains not as a political force but as a state of mind. For generations, the British were taught that theirs was an empire of virtue, that it brought order, justice, and civilization to a chaotic world. Schoolbooks told tales of explorers and engineers, of railway builders and lawgivers, of a benevolent power that spread progress to the farthest corners of the globe. Maps of the world, coloured in bright red, hung in classrooms, a visual promise that Britain's reach was boundless. Children grew up believing that to be British was to be destined for greatness. But time and truth have a way of softening myths. As historians peeled back the layers, another story emerged, one of violence, exploitation, and arrogance disguised as duty. The railways of India had been built to move troops and resources, not to serve the people. The plantations of the Caribbean had run on blood. The riches that filled British museums and banks had been drawn in large part from lands and lives taken by force. Yet even as these realities came to light, the myth endured, evolving rather than disappearing. The British imagination, uncomfortable with the cruelties of conquest, recast the empire as adventure, the noble age of discovery, the romance of distant lands, the pluck of explorers facing the unknown. Cinema helped sustain the illusion. Lawrence of Arabia striding through the desert, the bridge on the River Kwai. Zulu, stories of courage and endurance, yes, but also of control. Always the British figure remained the centre of the world's drama. But the world no longer revolved around Britain. In London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Leeds, the children of Empire's subjects were growing up. They were British, but also Indian, Pakistani, Jamaican, Nigerian, Bangladeshi, Ghanaian. Their grandparents had come to Britain as workers, their parents as citizens. They spoke English not as the language of the conqueror, but as their own inheritance, and they began to ask, whose story is this? Slowly, the mirror began to crack. Writers like Salman Rushdie, Zadie Smith, and Anif Qureshi captured the dissonance of post-imperial identity, the tug between belonging and alienation, pride and guilt. Musicians like Steel Pulse, The Specials, and later Stormzy turned that tension into sound. Art galleries that once celebrated colonial trophies now hosted exhibitions that questioned their very existence. Statues of Empire's heroes, Cecil Rhodes, Clive of India, became flashpoints in public squares. To some, they were symbols of heritage, to others, symbols of oppression. The debate over empire was no longer confined to history books. It was being fought in the streets, in classrooms, on television screens. Should Britain apologise? Should it pay reparations? Should it teach the truth about what the empire really was? These questions divided the nation not by geography, but by memory. For some Britons, the empire remained a source of pride, proof of national greatness in a world that felt uncertain and diminished. For others, it was a moral stain, a reckoning long overdue. Yet most lived somewhere in between, aware of the complexity, that the empire had built as much as it had broken, connected as much as it had divided. In many ways, this is the empire's final frontier, not territory, but truth. For the British Empire was never only about land, it was about identity, about who got to decide what civilization meant, whose history mattered, whose voice was heard. And that struggle, though fought now with words instead of weapons, continues still. But if empire was once about imposing one story upon many, then post-empire Britain has become the opposite, a chorus of stories. In a single London classroom, children trace their families to Somalia, Poland, India, Ireland, Jamaica, and Syria. Yet all of them share the same city, the same weather, the same language. The empire's old hierarchies have given way to something messier, but more human. The Britain of today is not the empire reborn. It is the empire remixed. The old world survives in strange ways. Cricket, that quintessential symbol of British leisure, is now dominated by India and Pakistan. The Commonwealth Games bring together countries that once lived under the British Crown, not as subjects, but as equals, competing and celebrating side by side. English itself, once a tool of rule, has become a global lingua franca, spoken by billions but owned by no one. Even the monarchy, that last living emblem of imperial grandeur, has had to adapt. The late Queen Elizabeth II was in many ways the bridge between worlds, crowned when the empire still existed, dying in an age when her face adorned currencies of nations that no longer bowed to her. When King Charles III took the throne, it was not as Emperor of India or defender of empire, but as a symbolic figurehead of a shrinking commonwealth, a network of nations bound not by chains, but by shared history. And yet, for all its change, Britain still wrestles with the shadow of what it once was. There is a quiet nostalgia that lingers in the corners of conversation, a longing for a time when the world seemed to listen. Politicians invoke global Britain, promising a return to influence, a renewal of the island's destiny on the world stage. But behind those words lies the same old dream, that Britain, small in size, might again be great in reach. Perhaps that is the final irony of empire, that it left Britain both larger and smaller than before. Larger because its influence, language and culture stretch across continents. Smaller because its people now see their nation not as master of the world, but as part of it. And maybe that is where the story finds its truest meaning. The empire was never a single act of domination or benevolence. It was a long, tangled conversation between peoples. Some voices were silenced, some were amplified, but all left their mark. In the end, the British Empire did not simply conquer the world. It changed it, and was changed by it in return. Its ships carried soldiers and settlers, but also ideas and contradictions, freedom and control, progress and plunder, pride and guilt. Those contradictions still echo in every institution, every word, every identity that traces back to it. The empire is gone, but its story is still being written, in the faces of the children who speak with accents shaped by 1,000 histories, in the songs that mix Caribbean rhythm with British slang, in the streets where temples stand beside churches and mosques. Britain once sought to rule the world. Today, the world lives within it. Under the red and gold glow of a fading sun, the story of the British Empire moves toward its quiet end. For centuries it had stretched its hand across the world, carving out an empire so vast that the sun, as the saying went, never set upon it. From the chill mists of Canada to the burning plains of India, from the jungles of Africa to the distant shores of Australia, it had left its mark in language, in law, in architecture, and in blood. But no empire, no matter how mighty, can escape the slow pull of time. What had once seemed eternal was now beginning to crack beneath the weight of its own ambition. The First World War was the Great Tremor. When the guns of August thundered across Europe in 1914, the empire entered the conflict with pride, confident in its strength. Its colonies answered the call. Indians, Australians, Canadians, South Africans, and countless others fought and died on foreign fields in defence of the crown. At the height of the war, British troops stood alongside men from every corner of the empire, all wearing the same uniform, all fighting beneath the same flag. The victory of 1918 was real, but it came at a staggering cost. The empire had survived, but it had been wounded, economically, morally, and spiritually. The illusion of invincibility was gone. In the decades that followed, the world began to change in ways that even Britain could not control. The United States emerged as a new power, rich, industrial, and confident, while across Europe revolutions and resentments smouldered. In India, long the jewel of the empire, a new spirit was rising. Men like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru spoke of freedom, of self-rule, of a destiny that no foreign ruler could suppress. Their call was not made with muskets or cannons, but with marches and boycotts, with the moral strength of millions united in purpose. For centuries, the British had ruled India through a mixture of awe, divide, and diplomacy. But now they faced something far stronger, the will of a nation. Meanwhile, in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, people who had once lived under the empire's shadow began to question their place in the world. They had fought in Britain's wars, worked in its mines and plantations, built its railways and cities, and yet they were denied the freedom for which they had shed blood. After the Second World War, this question could no longer be ignored. Britain had won again, but it had won at a terrible cost. London was scarred by bombs, its economy drained, its power diminished. The empire that had once ruled the seas now relied on American loans to rebuild its own streets. The tide of history had turned. Across the empire, the winds of independence began to blow. India was the first great wave. In 1947, the Union Jack was lowered and a new flag rose in its place. The moment was both triumphant and tragic, for the joy of freedom came with the pain of partition, of borders drawn in haste and millions displaced. Yet once that first domino fell, others soon followed. Burma, Ceylon, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Malaya. One by one, the great territories that had formed the empire began to step forward into the light of nationhood. Some transitions were peaceful, others were born in fire and struggle. But the direction was clear. The empire was unravelling, not all at once, but steadily, inexorably. By the time Queen Elizabeth II came to the throne in 1952, the empire had already begun its transformation into something new. It was no longer an empire of conquest, but a commonwealth of nations, a voluntary association, bound not by chains of rule, but by shared history and language. The British Empire, as it had once been, no longer existed. Yet its shadow stretched far beyond its own lifetime. Its influence remained in the maps, in the parliaments, in the schools, and in the very words people spoke across continents. English had become the global tongue, the language of diplomacy, of trade, of science. The laws and systems of government introduced under the empire took root and evolved in ways the old imperial administrators could never have foreseen. But legacy is a complicated thing. For all the bridges and railways, for all the universities and institutions, the empire had also left behind deep wounds. The scars of slavery, of economic exploitation, of cultural suppression. These did not fade with the lowering of a flag. The story of the British Empire is not one of simple triumph or failure. It is a tapestry woven from contradictions, of exploration and exploitation, of vision and violence, of enlightenment and empire. It gave the world Shakespeare and steam engines, democracy and the telegraph. But it also brought famine, conquest, and the displacement of millions. And yet, for better or worse, it changed the shape of the modern world. It was the empire that connected distant lands, that opened trade routes across the oceans, that made the global world of today possible. In its rise and fall lies the story of humanity's greatest ambitions and its deepest flaws. The men and women who built it, who served it, who resisted it, they were all part of a vast human drama that stretched across centuries and continents. From the first daring sailors who left English harbours in fragile wooden ships, to the last viceroys who packed their belongings and watched the sun set on the empire, they were witnesses to a story that reshaped the earth. In the end, the British Empire almost conquered the world, but not through sheer power alone. It conquered hearts and minds, ideas and institutions, the very rhythms of trade and culture. It spread a language that became the voice of billions, a legal system that still governs nations, and a sense of order, sometimes cruel, sometimes visionary, that bound the globe together. And though the empire itself is gone, its echoes still resound in every corner of the modern age, in the red phone boxes of Malta, in the cricket fields of India, in the parliamentary debates of Canada and Australia, in the railways of Africa, and the very words spoken by people thousands of miles apart. Today, Britain stands not as a ruler of empires, but as a small island with a vast past, a nation whose influence far outstrips its size. The age of empire is over, yet the story it wrote can never be erased. It is carved into history itself, a testament to human ambition, to the hunger for discovery and dominance, to the rise and fall of power. And so, as the curtain falls on this long and turbulent tale, we are left with a single truth. Empires may fade, flags may change, and borders may shift, but the mark they leave on the world endures. The British Empire may not have conquered the world in its entirety, but it came closer than any power before or since. Its legacy, for good and ill, still shapes the very world we live in today.